Okay, if everyone could please be seated. If you're not seated yet, we're going to start the program. We have a fairly tight schedule today. We want to give the speakers as much time as possible in a tight schedule. So we want to try to stay on point, and I know everyone wants to leave at 2 o'clock, so that's our goal. So I want to welcome everyone to the 2021 Energy Summit hosted by the Tyler Area Chamber of Commerce. I'm Gates Brailsford, the current chair of the subcommittee of the Energy Committee. So I just have a few introductory comments, and then I'll turn the program over to Claude Figueroa, our MC. A couple of points. One, this is a special summit for a couple of reasons. The first is that we're finally having the summit. It was originally scheduled, and I don't see one mask out there, so this is Tyler, Texas, no mask. It was supposed to be held in April of 2020. We rescheduled it twice, so our apologies, but you know what happened. So I'd first like to take a look back at our founding fathers of this event. 11 years ago, Tom Mullins, Ernie LaFleur, Bob Garrett, if he's back yet, and some other guys, they got together to they had the desire to try to fill the gap in perception and reality in the oil and gas business, which is still a problem, of course, but the focus was on the perception and the reality and the value of the industry to our society. Since then, it has grown in size and in scope and in recognition. So now we're able to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Energy Summit. I'm glad we're all here. The second point is, when we first started brainstorming as a committee, I guess it was about a year and a half ago, we chose a theme, and it's called the Texas Energy Matters, the changing face of Texas energy. You saw the little program with the windmills in the background. So oil and gas, of course, as we all know, will remain our primary source of energy for the foreseeable future. Wind and solar in particular have picked up and are coming on strong. But new technologies are being introduced frequently. You'll hear about one of those very important ones late in the day through one of our speakers, which I'm excited about. And if you add to that our new political reality, quote unquote, our political reality or unreality, then we do have a very interesting road ahead. So this is a transition summit in a sense. So our speakers today will address these issues. So that's what we're about. That's the theme. Lastly, I'd like to mention our Energy Summit team, which I'm very proud and honored to be a part of. These guys are just the greatest. We all are under the watchful eye of Henry Bell. He doesn't think so, but we are. Henry, thank you very much. Ernie LaFleur, Greg Jean, Ben Morgan, Brent Jasper, Scott Baker, Roy Maynard, Doug Brown, and Claude Figueroa. So now I'd like to clap for these guys because they did all the work. Now I'd like to turn it over to Claude Figueroa, who's our MC, and he'll take it from there. Thank you very much. Glad you're here.
Thank you, Gates, and thank you, everyone. I'm Claude Figueroa. I'm with Centerpoint Energy, and I'm also the chairman of the Energy Committee. It's a privilege to serve with these guys, and Gates really does a fantastic job putting this event together. And if you would please join me in a round of applause for Gates and his efforts. It's my pleasure to welcome you, and I thank you for being here. Your support of this event, it means a lot to us, and I'm excited as we get to explore the Texas energy matters and, of course, the changing face of Texas energy. At this time, I would like to recognize our sponsors. If it weren't for our sponsors, this event wouldn't be possible. I'm honored to recognize our presenting sponsor, Lockton Companies. Our platinum sponsors are Delek Refining and the Texas Oil and Gas Association. There's also recognition for our friends at Clemens Fluids, Golub Morgan Petty, Henry and Peters, Edge and Murray, Jasper Ventures, and Ridge Wireline. And if you'll notice, there is a list of our sponsors on the flip side of your program. And if you would look at those, and if you see some of our folks that are sponsors, if you just thank them, we greatly appreciate it. I'd like to do a hand for our sponsors. And now the tricky part of this part of the program is recognizing all the elected officials. Hopefully you gave your name to Henry or let us know you were coming, but I'd love to recognize our elected officials, and I'd love to thank you for everything you do, your representation, whether it's local or state or federal. We appreciate our elected officials. At this time, I'd like to recognize from U.S. Congressman Louis Gohmert's office, John Tanner, and also we have with us from 12th Court of Appeals, Chief Justice James Worthen, Judge Greg Neely, and also Judge Brian Hoyle. We have with us today also Texas Senator Brian Hughes, Texas Railroad Commissioner Wayne Christian, and from State Representative Cole Hefner's office, Sharon Guthrie. We also have Pete Olson, member of the Congress, 22nd District. Thank you very much for coming. And also, ladies and gentlemen, we have from the city of Tyler, of course, our beloved Mayor Don Warren, and Councilman Bob Westbrook, James Wayne, Brad Curtis, Shirley McKellar, Broderick McGee, and Stuart Henney. From Smith County, we have Judge Nathaniel Moran and Commissioner Neil Franklin. And also from Tyler Junior College, the Board of Trustees, Mr. Lonnie Uzel. And from the TISD Board Chair, we have Wayne Washman. A hand for our elected officials, please. At this time, I'd like to say a special word of thanks to Jamal Mohar of NDMJ for providing transportation services for our speakers, and also for Shelley Arnold at the Holiday Inn, the accommodations that she provided. We thank you so much for your support, and they've done this every year, and we are very, very thankful for them. If you noticed, some of the students from UT Tyler and SFA were here, and Brent Jasper with Jasper Ventures, along with Ernie LaFleur, they organized for these young folks to be here, and they kind of helped arrange things and all that. In the UT Tyler College of Engineering and Stephen F. Austin Geology Department, if you would please stand, we'd love to recognize y'all. Thank y'all very much. The future of engineering is in your hands. Today, we feel most honored to have a very special guest speaker. He's going to be the keynote, and that's United States Senator John Cornyn. The senator will arrive shortly, and if you'll notice, one thing I want to mention is there are index cards at your table. If you have a question related to energy, again, related to energy for the senator, please write it on that note card, and then one of our attendants will come by and pick that up to be shared with the senator. Again, an energy-related question, please. Now, before our first speaker starts, we have a short video to play, and this video is courtesy of Todd Staples of the Texas Oil and Gas Association. Unfortunately, Todd was not able to join us today due to a scheduling conflict, but he did share this brief video with us, and at this time, roll the video.
This is Texas. Welcome to the outdoors. When it it comes to our lands, natural gas and oil are investing. Because conservation is at our core, and our commitment to the environment is backed by hundreds of billions in investments and technologies to continue reducing emissions, improving air quality, making cleaner fuels, reducing the impact of our operations. And it's working. CO2 emissions from energy use across the entire economy are at the lowest levels in nearly 25 years. Methane emissions from onshore natural gas production are down, while production increased. Our fuels are more than 99% cleaner, and we're inventing new methods to reduce our footprint and carefully restore the land when our work is complete. The natural gas and oil industry will continue advancing environmental performance through innovative research, technology, and operational practices. Why are we doing all of this? Because we hunt, fish, hike, and play in the same places. These are our communities too. We believe in a better future, and natural gas and oil will get us there.
How's everybody doing today? My name is Ben Morgan, and I'm with Lockton Companies, and I must say it looks great to see everybody out there and actually be able to see a smile. I don't think I've seen one of those in about the past 12 months. So it's my pleasure to introduce somebody who I've gotten to call a friend over about the past 6 or 7 years, and he's a local East Texan here, and it's a pleasure that we've had him. I think this is our second time that we've had Wayne Christian join us. Wayne is a lifelong conservative and businessman. Wayne Christian was elected as our 50th Texas Railroad Commissioner in November of 2016. Throughout his career, Christian has excelled in a variety of industries and occupations. In music, and this is my most favorite part, I would have never guessed this, but in music, Christian took his family quartet from the local church house to the finalist stage in the Grammys in 1979. In 2015, the band was inducted, and I actually did not know this was a thing, so I learned something new every day. In 2015, the band was inducted in the Texas Gospel Music Hall of Fame. In business, yeah, go ahead, that's great. I don't know too many other elected officials that have Grammys. In business, Christian was transitioned from a small-town banker to the owner of a successful financial services office where he has been recognized as an AIG top advisor nationwide 3 times. In politics, Christian was elected to the House of Representatives as the first Republican elected from deep East Texas. I think that's a polite way to say the Piney Woods over here. From deep East Texas since Reconstruction after the Civil War. He served in the legislature for 7 sessions, accumulating a strong record of fighting for free markets against burdensome regulations. For his effort, he received numerous awards from conservative watchdog groups, including National Legislature of the Year from the American Legislative Exchange Conference. Christian is married to his wife, Lisa, and together they have 3 daughters and 5 grandchildren. Put your hands together and help me welcome Railroad Commissioner Wayne Christian.
Yeah, it's kind of bad when you start out in gospel music and you get into a lifestyle of going around in a bus, getting unloading and doing stuff back in that day. And I can't keep a job is what the story is. And of course, I go from something that's, religious gospel music, then I go into something secure like stockbroker and politician. Okay, so, that's my history. But, so do we have the slideshow up here or not, or am I just all air? Okay, I'm all air. That's good. Let me real quick tell you, what's the Railroad Commission? Railroad Commission, there we are. Railroad Commission, right now, Jim Wright, me, and Christie, we got 2 uglies and 1 pretty. And that's what the Railroad Commission now in the state taking. That's probably politically incorrect to say, but I'll say a lot of politically incorrect stuff probably before I'm through. But right now, I think the number I think you need to watch, prior to the pandemic, the total production of the state of Texas had reached the point that if we were a nation, we'd be number 4 in the world as a nation in production of oil and gas at 40% of the national production. Today, it's over 50%. What all Biden is doing in stopping this, keeping in the ground on public lands and shutting down all the public lands, the thing is Texas has probably less public land than almost any other state. And so our percentage of production has gone up of what the national total is. Now that's going to be probably good news for producers and a lot of the people in this room as the price of oil goes up. Where it is concerning is, of course, to the consumers, to the moms and pops out here that see the retail prices increasing. And so that's the concern, of course, is inflation that we see. But for oil and gas, another thing people now understand is the Railroad Commission of Texas was by Forbes magazine just a few years back, was called beyond question the most important regulatory organization for oil and gas on planet Earth. It's kind of astounding to work for that organization. Over 800 employees, 16 offices statewide, good Texas neighbors all across the state that have really produced great. And let's look at the next slide. This is petroleum production. Is it more than just gasoline? And I think people seem to misunderstand or forget. Oil and gas is probably, or oil and gas are probably almost everything we have. You look right now, plastics, glass, synthetic rubber, smartphones and tablets, medicine, fertilizer, pesticide, clothing, shoes, food preservation. The smallest portion of oil represented in an automobile is the gasoline in the tank. Think of that. You have the plastics, the nylons for the carpets, you have the rubber, you have all the different fiberglass, all the other is a much larger representation of oil and gas than is just the gasoline in the tank. And then also this argument you keep hearing from the side that wants to shut down oil and gas production is we need transportation to go to electric cars. Where do they think the electricity is coming from for those cars? It's kind of amazing to me to look and see Elon Musk and Toyota both came out with a press release saying there is not enough electricity being produced to have an entire electric fleet of cars. But what does the Biden administration have in its Clean Act is to go totally electric. And so we'll all be walking. Had a buddy of mine from Center, Texas that decided he'd buy him a Tesla. Buy him a Tesla. And he went to see his grandkids in Florida. He had to stop 5 times for 45 minutes to charge that sucker up. And he had to hunt places that he couldn't find anywhere to find a plug. So he got rid of his Tesla when he got back to Center. I just say it like that. So anyhow, what should our priorities be when we determine what the oil and gas or our energy is going to be? And in the next slide, it talks about REAP, and that's something one of my staff put together. I got too many initials, I can't remember anything, but just think of this and see if you agree as I kind of go forward. We need to have reliable, environmentally responsible, affordable, and plentiful energy, And the next slide goes to reliability, which is probably our top priority. And I don't know about y'all, y'all remember we had a little freeze a couple of months ago here in Texas. By the way, I don't normally refer to Bill Clinton in anything, but I can just say in accordance with his famous statement, I felt the pain. I was out turning the water on at our house, and my wife stays with the grandkids now more than she does me. So I was sitting there by myself from 11 o'clock on Sunday night till 11:30 on Thursday night. I had no electricity. I had no telephone of any kind except I'd get in my car and charge up the cell phone. I had the same 3 pair of clothes on all week, And I felt the pain, as President Clinton says, And by the way, Deep East Texas is not in the electric grid. So for all these people that say, whoa, the grid is terrible, we need to be able to get to the, didn't do me any good in Deep East Texas to be outside the grid. Just want you to know during that thing. During the storm, you heard fake news of all this stuff like gas froze in the pipelines. For those of you that know anything, gas doesn't freeze in a pipeline. Well, it can if it gets negative 100 and 200 degrees, I think, but it'd be more problems than just a freeze if it got that cold. but 46% of our average energy was on production in the grid. Gas was doing about 50%, okay, at the start of the storm. It ramped up gas in producing electricity to about 70%, while wind dropped from about 20% prior to the storm down to less than 6%, okay? Now, I'm just from Center, okay? I'm an East Texas guy. And my story of what I have found after all the griping, grunting, hearings, and all this, Senator Nichols, his quote was, "Natural gas saved the state of Texas." And understand, gas, we regulate the Railroad Commission natural gas. We do not regulate electricity. And we don't need to make light of those lives lost in the time that I and so many others of you were out of electricity. But just to be clear, we don't regulate electricity, we have natural gas. And by the way, the people that needed natural gas or propane during that storm in Texas, 99% of folks that turned on the valve got it. And that's pretty impressive of where natural gas was consistent during that worst crisis. My story of the storm, we have been spending a lot of time in the state of Texas and federally putting money in the unreliables and let the pilot light go out on our reliables. And what's frightening is going forward, Texas' plan as of this date. We have planned on the books 11.6 gigawatts of unreliable solar, 8.4 gigawatts of unreliable wind, 5 gigawatts of gas, no nuclear, no coal. You know, Einstein said the evidence of an idiot was somebody that kept doing the same thing expecting a different result. And so that's exactly where I see us going, folks, that we just keep putting all this money into wind and solar. And I'm all for startup operations, okay? I'm all for, a lot of people aren't, okay? Startup operations, I think, is where you help a company get going or help an industry get going, or some of our colleges do research and help out like our good colleges and all do. But startup on wind and solar has been going on from the federal government about 40 years now. And from the state of Texas about 26 years now. And I think after about 40 or 20 years, you pretty well can make a determination of whether something can exist without taxpayer dollars. And they can't, okay? Let's talk about being environmentally responsible. It's kind of amazing to look at those, see, I'm losing my place on my slides here. What we're talking about here is just look at the environmental responsibility of what's going on. You look, the EPA was talking about the major pollutants and all from the EPA have gone, we have decreased by 77% the amount of the gases, this is EPA results, over the past 50 years. 77% down on every poisonous gas they identify. At the same time, we've increased by 300%, 285% the U.S. economic growth, which is more machines, more cars, more things. And also we've increased by 48% to 60% U.S. population and consumption by 48%, while decreasing by 77% pollution of EPA-identified gases. I think it's pretty impressive. In Texas, on flaring rates, amazing, flaring has been used in the state of Texas. Y'all have seen it, it is environmental catastrophe, the flaring going on, all the methane. It's terrible, the flaring is horrible. You've heard the environmental wackos come up with this stuff. Guess what, folks? 2 years ago, flaring in Texas was about 2.7%, went down prior to the COVID to about 1.7%. Right now, state of Texas, 0.07% of natural gas is being flared. Now, get this in your mind. This is how desperate they are for something to grab. We got 99.3% of natural gas is going to its totally clean use and intended purpose today in the state of Texas, and it's a climate crisis when you turn on the news. Okay? All right, let's use some logic here from Joe Biden, which is oxymoron. Logic from Joe Biden when he says, and this was his last speech to Congressman, he said the United States courts counts for less than 15% of carbon emissions, the rest of the world for 85%. Even if we do everything perfect, it's not going to matter. And then the next sentence goes, and because of that, I've rejoined the Paris Accord. Now understand what the Paris Accord is. The Paris Accord is $78 trillion, and China's exempt, Russia's exempt, all the dirty folks are exempt, and it's going to cost Americans, understand, in the whole reason for the Paris Accord. Their goal is by, I think, 2040, I may have the date wrong, they're supposed to reduce the temperature on planet Earth potentially, maybe, if and buts, candies and nuts, if they can. The whole goal of the Paris Accord and all the money they're going to spend, $78 trillion, is to get the temperature hopefully not to increase by 1.7 degrees Celsius. I had a soccer game in Atlanta, Texas, where my 3 grandkids were playing. I turned on the news the night before of what the temperature was going to be in Atlanta, Texas, the next morning. It said about 68 degrees. I put on my short sleeve shirt and took my lawn chair, headed up to see my grandkids. I get there and it was 38 degrees. I froze my you-know-what off. Now, I ask you folks, if they can't tell you within half a day what the weather's going to be, we're going to pay $78 trillion with a T on it dollars for potentially 1.7 degrees by 2040. Now, let me tell you how it breaks down. It breaks down to 15, it's 1.5 trillion per year, I think it is, to the United States. That is 15,000 a year to every household in this nation, the cost. And what does Joe Biden say it's going to do? If we do it, it's not going to matter. Okay? I mean, the IEA is the International Environmental Association or agency. It's the number one recommender of detail and research and all to all the countries of the world, the United Nations, everybody, IEA. And about a month ago, they came out with their report, and the report said a couple of things. That hard metals and things like to produce batteries, rare earth metals, all these hard metals, they cost more environmental damage to go in and dig holes, and it takes longer to get it done, and to start these new caves and caverns like mining for coals and lignite. You dig into the ground to get it, and the harder metals are much more harmful to the environment, and it's going to be decades before you can really get that up and running. Okay? Also, electric cars produce more environmental pollution than do gasoline and diesel cars. This is IEA. A week later, their result, get this logic, okay, was that we need to stop all oil gas drilling around the world, and we need to go to all electric cars. Okay, I'm from East Texas. I'm not exactly bright, but I can tell you what they found out don't jive with what they're recommending, okay? And let's look at Obama. In 2009, he quoted this, President Obama, "Rising seas threaten every coastline." 2019, rising seas threaten every coastline. He and Michelle bought a $14.8 million mansion in Martha's Vineyard at sea level. Either the realtor didn't tell him everything about where he was buying, or, okay? Let's talk about affordability. How much you think we're to spend propping up unreliable energy at the expense of the reliables, okay? Have y'all ever noticed the price going up lately? You know, just a little bit. Let's take subsidies. Let's go to the next slide. Subsidies up here. Let's talk. Right now, natural gas gets about 39 cents federal energy subsidies. Wind gets $18.86, that's 48 times. And solar gets $82, which is 211 times that of natural gas. The government will even pay you to buy an electric car. Do you know you can get a federal tax credit of $7,500 in a Texas state, God forbid, of $2,500? It's $10,000 to go buy an electric car. Your tax dollar. Okay? Now understand, let me make it clear. I'm for all forms of energy. If you can make gasoline from water, God bless you, let's go after it and get it. Okay? Yeah, I'm not knocking that. But this stupid word that we've come up with, that we're for all the above. You heard that? Heard anybody say that? We're for all the above. That includes cow manure in the fireplace, wood chips, you know, back to the stove kettle. That's all. I mean, I'm from Tenny Hall, Texas, public school, public education, and I at least know that all means all. And we ain't for everything. Anybody with any sense is not for everything. So I'm for whatever will be profitable and will work and keep us going. Let me give you real quick some of the cost involved here. Right now, the state of Texas, and Jason Isaac is here, and a couple from the Texas Public Policy Foundation, Todd Staples, good friend, head there. And the thing is in the next decade, we're looking at a total of $36 billion from the state of Texas for wind and solar. $36 billion. Think that would make any difference in the budget anywhere? If the Paris Accord passes, which he signed back onto, it's going to cost about $15,000 per household by 2040 in the United States. The Green New Deal has a total price tag per household of $600,000. The Clean Futures Act, $2 trillion, is going to be $3,500 per household, per taxpayer. That's $6,000, $7,000 per household. Ban fracking, right now the estimate's $2,500 a year on gasoline and electric bills alone to each family in the United States. Does any of this sound weird to y'all? Okay, and let's look into what's the other part of this thing. Let's look into the next slide, which was plentiful part. We need plentiful energy. We need a supply. We're running out of natural gas. We're running out of gas and oil. Jimmy Carter told us down there in the bottom, he told us, and y'all I know are all too young to remember that. Jimmy Carter put on his sweater and sat there and said, turn your thermostats up to 72. We're out of oil and gas in 8 years, right? Then you go back to this. I went to the Energy Council's conference up in Alaska when I first got in. And at that time, the governor of Alaska spoke to us and he said, we have 34 billion barrels of reserve, 34 billion barrels of reserve in the United States. That's from Alaska through Brownsville, 34 billion. The day after I was elected, this is the truth, my wife and I were going to Todd Stable's Texoka's event down at Bastrop on the way home after my election day. And on the radio came on 2 items. One, that the EPA had dropped a lawsuit against the state of Texas on some type of environmental issue. Second thing is they had just found the largest discovery of oil and gas in history in Midland, Texas. It was fun to go to the Texoka meeting that night and say, well, first day on the job, I got you the largest discovery of oil in history, and I dropped an EPA lawsuit up there for you. It was a pretty good first day's work. Let me tell you the story of that. I go back out to Midland about a year and a half ago, and they're sitting here. When we first started digging the holes out there, you go through layers. You know, y'all are more aware of that. First layer, second layer, we were up to about 80 billion barrels from the 34, from it started, then up to about 100. All of a sudden, I go in there, and Van Taylor's dad, great oil man from out in Midland for decades, Mr. Taylor said, Wayne, I just believe that there's, my guys here that have estimated this stuff for decades accurately say there's 200 billion barrels out here. I'm sitting there going, well, okay, Mr. Thank you a lot. So I wasn't going to say anything because that sounded unreal, right? I get back to Houston to an oil and gas company about 2 weeks later, and I was talking with the president there, and I said, man, Mr. Taylor told me that he estimated 200 billion barrels out there. It's unreal. I said, no, he's wrong. And his engineering staff came up and rolled out all the papers and everything. He said, no, it's 230 billion barrels. Ladies and gentlemen, let me give you this. Whereas in Jimmy Carter said 8 years, when I first came into office, it was 34 billion barrels, 230 billion barrels. That is an estimate of 430 years of oil, 575 years of natural gas, and 500 years of coal that we have under current technology. What Jimmy Carter, Al Gore, all the greenies never put in the calculator is that we're all a bunch of dogs and horses, and there is no technological advancement in what we're doing. So according to current technology, we've got 500 years. I think we'll invent ways to improve stuff. We always have, and get more bang for the buck. Real quickly, it's amazing that we can sit and just listen to the lies and deception. Turn to the next one. I love, this is my favorite slide. How consistent climate change and climate crisis the climate catastrophists are. This is Time Magazine's cover. In 1973, the Big Freeze. 1977, Big Freeze. 2001, global warming. 2006, be worried, global warming. I'll tell you a little story that happened and why the ship's up there. A bunch of university professors from Texas University rented a Russian ship and headed out to the pole to measure the melting ice, because we have global warming, all the icebergs were melting, we was going to lose the poles, we was all getting flooded like Obama told us on the seashores, because the water was all rising from all the ice that was melting. And on Christmas Day, I think it was December 25th, 1987, I think was the date, not positive on the date, their ship got froze in. And they had to call a U.S. icebreaker to come bail them out. Well, we didn't hear any more global freezing and no warming after that. It went to climate change. That was the new terminology, climate change. Then it's gone to climate crisis. And then, like flaring, 0.5% is a climate crisis. And that's the consistency in their message. It's John Coleman, who is the Weather Channel inventor, the climatologist. He said it's the biggest scam in the history of the world. The world is going to end in 12 years if we don't do something, AOC said in 2019. And as little as 10 years, it's going to make it impossible to avoid irretrievable damage to the planet's habitat for human civilization. Okay? That was Al Gore in 2006. Every one of their detrimental crises the world's going to come to an end has been proven wrong. So they're consistent. Okay? Next page, and this is what I think is the most important, that it was told to us by Mona Stephan, the Deputy Chief of Staff of Policy under President Barack Obama, stated at an event Alan Gilmer had for us early in my time as your railroad commissioner, and she said, we have achieved, as I said earlier, energy security. For the first time in 70 years, we were a net exporter. America was the #1 producer of oil and gas for the first time in 70 years. That's financial security, making money we never made. Y'all were doing great, everything booming, going great in the state of Texas. But she said the place that y'all are missing to the public is national security. Understand, and you look back, why was it our immediate former president in the last 4 years did not have to enter an international skirmish? Why was that? Guess what? We didn't need anybody's energy anymore. I was over at Israel with the Ambassador Friedman, our ambassador to Israel. I was at an event, and I asked him, I said, did the discovery of oil make any difference on what you'd been negotiating his? He turned to me and he said, the ambassador of Israel, he said, all the difference in the world. He said, in fact, I'm on international calls monthly with the ambassadors across the world, and we are evermore saying that it's made all the difference worldwide to the power and negotiating authority of the United States. So it's, I think we just don't understand, and what Barack Obama's advisor said, if y'all would let the moms and dads across this country understand that because you have got energy security and national security, their boys and girls don't have to go to war anymore and lose their lives. Folks, national security is so important, and I think it's been missed totally in what God has given us in this find of oil and gas. Let's look to the next one is talking about threats to American energy independence. One thing I want to talk about real quickly is our ESG funds, environmental, social, and governance funds. Being a stockbroker, okay, I look at that, and I'm sitting here going, okay, what has happened is that all of a sudden Wall Street and these big bankers have decided we're going to not fund any oil and gas or any type funding of that in our stock market investments, our mutual funds, the investments people have, the loans that banks are now making, and Biden is insisting they do this. And Phil King and Senator Birdwell just passed a law in the state of Texas that none of our tax dollars, none of our savings accounts, none of our investment retirement accounts will be in any company or bank that discriminates against oil and gas or any single industry, so I'm proud of Texas. But right now, a lot of our companies can't get dollars and cents because they have shut down financing in this ESG funds to our oil and gas industry. So this is damaging. In fact, as of now, they've taken $17 trillion with a T on it dollars away from availability to our oil and gas businesses to rebound after this downturn. Think of that. That is 1/3 currently of all invested dollars. Now, where that harms as a stockbroker, I can tell you over the past 10 years that if you didn't have oil and gas in your portfolio, you'd get 25% less return on your money. So they're ripping off the retirees. They're ripping off, and there is no legal stature. The SEC has implemented an investigation. There's no legal reason, nor is it a fiduciary that I'm responsible to one of my clients or to an investor of these companies. And you look at Exxon, you look at Shell, you look at BP, all these that international investors are buying. Shell, last week, the Deer Park refinery in Texas was purchased a majority holding or 40% controlling interest by the country of Mexico. So now Mexico now controls our refinery down in Deer Park in the state of Texas. All right, next slide I think is something that I think is amazing to me. When I look back at so what the next slide is, the power bad. That's what I'm on, Mr. Slide person. Yeah. This is an interesting book. Read it, and it's talking about the power of bad. If I walked into you in your office once a week, I was a salesman, come to your office, and I said, "Man, you're great, you're super, you dress so good, man, it's good to see you. You're such a good, oh, you look good, you whatever, like your grandkids are looking good, all this kind of stuff." And I said that, and I went there for 10 years every day. But I walked in one day and said, "You the ugliest thing I ever saw." Good Lord, who put that on your head? What are you going to remember about me? The bad. And that's what this book's talking about. It talks about families, everything, but it also talks about environmental. Folks, we have the cleanest, best country in the history of the world. We are the cleanest industrialized nation on planet Earth. And for us to accept shut down oil and gas production, which is Washington trying to get us to do, or at least the administration, is insane, because guess who's going to fill the gap? The absolute dirtiest. You know, I was talking about China produces all of the things that they use 300 coal plants they built last year for generation to build these windmills and solar panels to bring over here and clean up our environment at taxpayer expense with the unreliables. We lose not only economic security, energy security, but again, our national security. And why is it? Well, the news media has to have the power of bad. News isn't news unless they got something to be against and bad about. Politicians, Brian, me and you got to have something bad to talk about to run, something you got to run to. I'm going to fix this, I'm going to fix that. Okay, right? It's power of bad. And you also got a special interest groups. Any of your lobbyists in Austin, Texas have got to know, that, well, I've got something to fight for. I fight against whatever like that. So it's the power of bad. But an interesting article I read that's absolutely amazing was titled, "We've had the best decades in recorded human history." Think of that, folks. All this we hear on the news, how terrible everything is, how all this only gets, we have had the best, most successful decade in human recorded history. And I think we need to start remembering that and quit watching TV. And I've weaned off of everything I possibly can. Poverty at the beginning of the decade was 40% worldwide. It's now 10% and less. Understanding the entire world, if you're the lowest person on welfare in the United States of America, think of this. If you are the poorest designated person receiving welfare in the United States of America, you have more heated square foot you live in, you eat more red meat, you're more likely to have an automobile, a cell phone, and a television than the average citizen of the second richest place on planet Earth, Western Europe. Digest that. God has been good to this state. He's been good to this nation. And how dare we turn it around? My grandmother came from West Texas. And from West Texas, she came on a freight train to Tennehaw, Texas, where my granddad came in a covered wagon from Georgia with his family. They met. The lifespan at that time, my dad's 3 brothers and them, they worked daylight to dark 6 days a week, took off on Sunday, but daylight to dark just to put food on the table. And I remember lifespan then was about 45 years of age. 1/3 of the families lost a child under 10 years of age. There were diseases for which there were no cure. The 2 environmental causes of death that were prevalent were freezing to death when there was no heat and starving to death when there were no crops. That was Texas in that day and age. Move it forward. Average lifespan today is 80 years old, 79 years old. Okay? We have 1.5% of our population feeds 1/3 of the world. That turns the whole nation loose to achieve the American dream, to do things besides work daylight to dark 6 days a week. Think of that. That's just since the 1900s, since the Industrial Revolution. Starvation being a cause? No, we have an obesity problem. And as far as freezing to death, we'll gripe and grunt because the thermostat's 2 degrees too warm or cold in any room we go into. It's just amazing to me of how good God has been to the state of Texas. And it's time that we started realizing that. And my closing slide here, we always say, God bless Texas. I think God has blessed our state of Texas. Great old Pastor Henry Blackaby, who I learned a lot from, experiencing God, knowing, doing the will of God. He's a good Baptist, so the church won't throw me out for saying this, good Baptist. And Henry had this saying that a person's faith was shown more by what they did, not while they were on their knees, but the first step they took when they got up off their knees. Let me close today with a challenge, ladies and gentlemen. I think it's about time we got up off our knees and put on our big boy and girl britches and took a bold stand for oil and gas and for this nation. We're losing it. And it's not to wait and let just our congressman, who's been such a good steward of what he's trying to deal with, I can't imagine, or our politicians in Austin that are represented here today. That's not what we need to turn to. Is we need to turn back and understand that we are doing things right. And when you're doing things right, let's put on our big boy and girl britches and step out there and let's fight the fight. One thing I want to close with, and that's the close of my speech, okay, yay. We have a special thing, well, I got 3 minutes. And I mentioned this to y'all earlier. Employment in the state of Texas has been down. And we are needing workers in the oil and gas industry from every level. And we had a task force, Jason Isaac and others that were involved with up in Austin, and we've been working up there to how do you increase employees and find out the best group of workers that is available in the entire state, literally are in rural East Texas. And we're putting an energy school together, attempting to, and we'll be meeting this next month with Stephen F. Austin and I believe Panola Community College. And it's for an energy school that has a curriculum that's being brought up to us from Houston of artificial intelligence and how we train people to get in this new computer world on oil and gas and environmental and all this. And I'd appreciate your prayers. I'd appreciate your interest. If you're interested in helping out and getting to know more about it, it's one of those side projects I'd like to see us happen, is to have an opportunity for our boys and girls from right here in deep East Texas to get involved. It would be the only school of its kind in the entire nation. And I think it's a great opportunity for us in East Texas. Thank you for what you do. Thank you. You've made America better. Thank you for being people who are responsible for people achieving their American dream. Thank you for bringing our country out of what was totally in the Industrial Revolution, a place where you had to work your rear end off and rarely achieve those dreams that you read about. Now, every child almost in this country has that opportunity, and it's because of oil, gas, and coal. Thank you very much.
All right. It is my pleasure now to introduce the chairman of the Tyler Area Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Roy Martinez.
Thank you, Claude. Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Roy Martinez. I have the honor of being able to serve as the chair of the Tyler Area Chamber of Commerce. So, along with Gates and Claude, I want to welcome everyone that's here. A special thank you to our presenters, to our members, and then also to our sponsors. Again, we cannot do these things without your support. So thank you very, very much. I also want to welcome those who are maybe not from the East Texas area. We are welcoming you here. We'd love for you to stay as long as possible, get to know our area, get to know our people. That's really what makes us who we are. We're grateful to have you. Please come again as you can. So right now I have the honor of introducing our guest speaker, our keynote speaker, and the moderator that we have. So I'm going to start with giving a short bio, and they're here seated already to my right. So thank you very much, gentlemen. So we have Mr. Kenneth Waits. Ken Waits. He's received his Bachelor's of Science degree in Petroleum Engineering from the University of Oklahoma in 1983 and pursued graduate business studies at UT Tyler in 1988. Upon graduation from OU, he joined Mewburn Oil Company as a field operations engineer in Oklahoma and has spent his entire career with the company. So Ken now serves as the president and chief executive officer of Mewburn Oil Company. Now, based in Tyler, Mewburn has become the largest privately owned oil producer in America. It employs over 500 people. The company is one of the largest producers in the Permian and Anadarko basins, and recently recognized by an independent firm as the most profitable oil company in the Permian Basin. So Ken is former chairman of the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association, serves on the board of the Permian Basin Petroleum Association, and has served on numerous other industry and local boards. Ken is a longtime supporter of OU and was honored with the Distinguished Alumni Award in 2010 and the Regents Alumni Award in 2016. Ken and his wife of 32 years, Laura, reside in Tyler, and they are proud parents of Hannah Waits, a junior at OU. So Ken, thank you very much for doing this today. Now, sitting alongside Ken, we have, as you all know, our United States Senator, John Cornyn. He's currently serving as his fourth term in the U.S. Senate, where he sits on the Senate Judiciary, Finance, and Intelligence Committees. He served the people of Texas for nearly 4 decades as a Bexar County District Judge, a Justice on the Texas Supreme Court, and as Texas Attorney General. As a senator for the top energy producing state, Senator Cornyn has fought for an all-of-the-above energy policy to fuel Texas families and millions of jobs across the nation. He supports our robust energy sector through his leadership, creating a competitive tax and policy environment, providing a trained workforce, and fighting unnecessary over-regulation. So please welcome me in joining our good friend and Texas Senior United States Senator, John Cornyn. Thank you. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Hello. Everybody hear me okay? Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And Senator Cornyn, welcome to Tyler.
Good to be back.
And welcome to the Northeast Texas Energy Summit. We're honored to have you here with us today, and we appreciate your willingness to share your thoughts with us about energy.
Or anything else.
Okay, we may take you up on that. And we'll have about 20 minutes of questions that the Energy Summit leadership has put together for us, and then we thank you for your questions that y'all asked, and we'll fit those in the last 10 minutes or so, Senator Cornyn. But again, we appreciate you being with us here today in Tyler. We're honored to have you, sir. Thank you. Well, Senator Cornyn, before we get started with our program, Pete Olson is a U.S. Congressman, and also many of you may not realize he's former Chief of Staff for Senator Cornyn, and tells me that you made quite the first impression on your wife, Sandy, on your blind date.
Well, thank you for the question, and Pete, I know where you live. I will hunt you down. So, yeah, my wife and I have been married 41 years, and I can't believe that she's put up with me that long. I know many of you guys in the audience could say the same, but I was finishing law school in San Antonio, and my wife was going back to school. She was a school teacher in middle school in South San Antonio Independent School District. She was going back for another degree in accounting at Incarnate Word College there. And a friend of mine had just recently started dating a very attractive young woman, and I said, well, where did you find her? And he said, well, this other friend of ours, we're going to law school. I said, well, do you think he's got any more like where she came from? And so lo and behold, I ended up getting a telephone number, a potential blind date, but I had to call up and say, in one of the worst opening lines possible, I said, hi, my name's John Cornyn. Does that ring a bell? She said no. But then I went to pick her up. Fortunately, she said yes eventually. I went to pick her up, and she looked through the peephole of her apartment door, and she told me later on that she gasped and said, they fixed me up with an old man. Because even back then I had white hair thanks to my mother, and but anyway, yeah, Sandy's a saint, like a lot of political wives, like a lot of our wives who put up with our challenges, our careers, and our aspirations. But yeah, that was not the best of beginnings.
Well, amen. We appreciate you sharing that with us, Senator. Well, sir, we'll jump right in here. Senator Cornyn, East Texas has a rich history in the oil and gas business, and many people in this room, including myself, work in the industry. And we're proud, as Wayne Christian talked earlier, about the work we've done. We provide the most affordable, reliable, secure energy in the world. We've reduced our imports of foreign oil, increased our energy security, and due to clean burning natural gas, no country in the world has done more to reduce greenhouse gas emissions than the U.S. Can you comment, please, sir, on some of the recent executive orders and proposed legislation that have been discussed and proposed by the Biden administration?
Well, I appreciate the question, and I agree with the premise of the question entirely. Unfortunately, climate change has become a religion, and it's very difficult, I think, because most of the time people take for granted what you do day in and day out, which is provide low-cost, clean, self-sufficient energy and low cost for people on fixed income, seniors and the like. And you would think that the country would appreciate that and would want to see that continue. I think right now President Biden's guiding principle when it comes to his executive orders is whatever the previous administration did, we're going to undo it. I don't think it's more complicated than that. But they haven't thought about what the second and third order consequences are going to be. Back when, I guess in World War, back when Winston Churchill was the Lord of the Admiralty in England, they went from coal-fired to oil-powered ships. And of course, that transformed the importance of the Middle East and sources of oil and energy, and which obviously, because we've been dependent on imports for so long until recent years, this is a national security threat. Back in 1980, Jimmy Carter said, if any country blocks the Strait of Hormuz, it's an act of war. And fortunately, because of what the industry has done, the great innovation, the investment, I mean, you were in the technology business, really, it seems like to me, just as an outside observer, and have produced such great outcomes. But unfortunately, it makes it very hard in Washington, D.C., when this sort of religious attachment to climate change seems to trump all else. And we saw that recently in the Senate Finance Committee, where Chairman Wyden basically produced a bill that would tax domestic oil and gas businesses, frankly, many of them out of existence, would invest $174 billion in electric vehicles. I mean, at least what we could do, when I was talking to the head of ExxonMobil recently, talk about this huge carbon capture project that they're undertaking in the Houston area. He said, I know, Senator, you're not for a carbon tax. I said, no, you're right, I'm not for a carbon tax. He said, but it is important, if you're going to focus on carbon, to price carbon. Because he said there's a whole lot more efficient ways to reduce carbon in the atmosphere than subsidize electric cars for rich people. And I think he's absolutely right. But unfortunately, that's the battle we're fighting these days in Washington, D.C.
Right. No, certainly it does appear that it's become a religion, as you said, and I also appreciate, again, what Commissioner Christian said earlier. I think the industry is going to have to fight for the things we do and tell our story a little better. I think we have an energy literacy problem in this country, and those of us in the industry, I think, can do more to help in that area. But thank you for your answer, sir. Our second question has to deal with something that will be discussed this afternoon. We had a little winter storm around here in February, many affectionately referred to as Snowmageddon or Snowvid. You can take your choice there. But you recently introduced legislation, Senator, to help fund the weatherization of electrical grids across the nation called the Power On Act. And we thank you for that. And this would provide much needed financial support for our Texas utilities to upgrade facilities and protect our infrastructure from extreme weather events. Can you tell us a little bit about how this is progressing? And I might ask you also to comment on the restructuring of ERCOT and even Berkshire Hathaway's proposal to get involved in and invest in our state's infrastructure.
Well, I think I'll just hand my microphone to Senator Hughes. Well, the truth is a lot of us are looking at this because this is, what, a 120-year weather event? And we weren't prepared. You know, in politics, if you ask people to pay for something, which is essentially insurance against an unlikely future event, they're going to look at you and say, well, is that really the best use of my tax dollar? But we did find ourselves with this historic cold weather event, and it reminds me a little bit of the old story about the blind men describing an elephant. And depending on what part of the elephant you got a hold of, you described it as a foot or a trunk or an ear or the like. But here, because we are an all of the above energy state, depending on your perspective, people described it as, this is reason why we need to go to 100% renewables. Well, I don't, that's not, to me, that's not the lesson I learned from this, because the wind turbines froze, the solar panels were covered up, and others said, well, we need to, emphasize oil and gas production. Well, gas pipelines don't work very well, I understand, when you don't have any electricity to compress the gas. And then, the only reliable base load really turned out to be nuclear. And of course, nuclear has been in disrepute for a while because of the problems with nuclear waste disposal. But to me, it demonstrated a need for a diverse energy supply and a reliable base load, because as we all know, sometimes the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, and you got to have something to keep the place running in that situation. But what I asked my staff to do is I knew this Texas Senate and Texas Legislature and the governor were going to be focusing like a laser on that issue, and I know you have, Brian. But we've tried to figure out, is there something at the federal level we could do? And so I joined with a friend of mine, a Democrat from California, with whom I agree on virtually nothing, but to work on a grant program through the Department of Energy to provide financial incentives to the states to weatherize their electrical grid and infrastructure. And in California, it's wildfires that shut down the electricity there. And Texas, obviously, we need to do a little better job weatherizing our grid against unlikely but possible events like this. So I know there are a lot of different proposals. You mentioned the Berkshire Hathaway proposal and others. Obviously, we don't want to do anything more than we have to do to burden ratepayers, because we know none of this is free. But I consider myself to be sort of in a complementary role to what the Texas legislature and the governor are doing to see what we can do to do our part, but recognizing that they really were the ones at the tip of the spear.
Well, on behalf of everybody in this room, we thank you for not agreeing with the Californians, sir.
They get it wrong most all the time. Occasionally they slip up and say something sensible.
Yeah. Well, sir, you may have heard of the recent cyber attack on the Colonial Pipeline, and there's been another one, of course, here recently on the meat company, JBS. And I'd like to think that this attack on the pipeline reminded us all that we still need fossil fuels. I'm not sure that's the case, but it also reminded me of the saying, you never want a serious crisis to go to waste. What I mean by that is a crisis creates an opportunity to do things that you may not have been able to do otherwise. How do you think President Biden will respond to this cyber attack crisis? With greater appreciation that the energy transition will be a transition, with more green energy initiatives, or with more regulation of pipelines?
Well, I'm not confident it will be a logical response based on facts and the evidence. But I would say that one of my biggest concerns for our country is our vulnerability to cyber attacks. And what I mean by that is we've all discovered that during the COVID-19 how important broadband is and access to the internet. I've told people that only two good things that came out of COVID-19 were telemedicine and margaritas to go. That's the only two things I can think of that was good that came out of COVID-19. But we learned the importance of having access to broadband because of our kids having to learn virtually until they can get back in the classroom. So I do consider broadband to be part of critical infrastructure, particularly in this modern age we're living in. But we have to recognize that our adversaries around the world, particularly China, but to some extent Russia, have a totally different view of the internet. First of all, their own citizens don't get access to that information. They're blocked off. The Great Firewall in China, it's a police state, so they don't want their subjects, their citizens, to learn what's happening in America or other places around the world. And they literally, of course, attack our infrastructure to steal our intellectual property, which is where China is the most aggressive. Russia uses cyber attacks not so much to do things like steal IP, but they do use it to try to create chaos and disruption in our society. It's well documented, of course, back in 2016, that they use what they call active measures, which is disinformation, to create chaos and conflict and stir up conspiracy theories and the like. Basically, President Xi and President Putin want to be able to say to their people, look at America. They're a mess. They're in chaos. There's disturbances. There's lack of security. And we are a better form of government for our people, which, of course, nobody believes with an ounce of brain power. But the cybersecurity thing is a huge problem because we don't know to what extent our infrastructure's already been infiltrated and could be with a flick of a switch or a click of a mouse shut down. And of course, there's no real difference between the criminal organizations that shut down the Colonial Pipeline and the Russian government, because essentially the whole Russian government is run by corrupt individuals. So this, I think, is a huge vulnerability and one we really need to up our game on.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Well, Senator Cornyn, the administration seems every day, we're all reading about it in the paper, is proposing a multi-trillion-dollar plan to broadly rebuild U.S. infrastructure and move the power sector to 100% emissions-free electricity by 2035. Can you give us an update on how this is progressing and how you see this impacting our state, please, sir?
Well, I think it's pure fantasy in the first place. Again, this is part of the cult or religion of renewable energy, and this is just the Green New Deal wearing other clothes. So obviously, we are taking what is a great national asset and jeopardizing that by taxing and regulating it into oblivion. The tax code alone, they want to pay you $7,500 to subsidize your purchase of a new electric vehicle, while oil and gas companies are being denied their basic operating business deductions. But this is not part of the narrative in D.C. So I think the biggest problem is this industry does its job so well that people have come to take it for granted. And I agree with Wayne. There's basic illiteracy when it comes to energy. I actually asked my colleagues in Washington, D.C., said, oh, you want us to go to all electric vehicles? Talk about socialism for rich people. These high-priced vehicles, you want hard-working Texans to subsidize your purchase of a F-150 electric pickup truck, which comes in around $100,000. It's craziness. But my question to them is, do you know where electricity comes from? And they look at me like I'm asking a dumb question. Well, it comes from coal, it comes from natural gas, it comes from renewables, and hydro, depending on where you live, and maybe some nuclear. But there's just simply a complete ignorance when it comes to what the sources of energy are. So even if you've drunk the Kool-Aid and you believe in socialism for rich people, that you ought to subsidize wealthy people's purchase of electric vehicles to save the planet, well, you still got to come up with the electricity to charge the battery.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. Thank you, sir. We'll move into the questions from the audience, please, sir, if that's okay. Sure. And we have some good ones, I think. The first one is, do you believe the University of Oklahoma will win the Big 12 again this year? That one must have come from the Mewburn table. I'm sorry.
When I heard you went to the University of Oklahoma, I figured that matched up pretty well with Curtis Mewburn's background, so I understand the Oklahoma connection.
Okay. No, this is a great question. There's been a lot of discussion throughout the country, in particular here in Texas, about improving our telecommunications and broadband. And the question is generally about funding for broadband in Texas. And can you share with us your thoughts about when that might happen?
Well, I know the Texas legislature has paid a lot of attention to this, and there's a lot of money available both at the federal level and the state level, but I think we need to come up with a strategy to make sure that whatever investments the government or taxpayer makes in enhancing access to broadband doesn't compete with the private sector. It supplements what the private sector is already doing, because of course it's commercially attractive to the private sector to build out that broadband in dense populations where they have a lot of customers. But out in West Texas or somewhere like that, or in the Rio Grande Valley where I was yesterday, about a third of the kids who were supposed to go to school virtually, they didn't have access to broadband. And you can't obviously go to virtual school if you can't get on the internet. So I think we're all recognize the importance of this, but again, my guiding principle is let's not compete with the private sector. Let's figure a way to supplement the non-economic applications which will actually enhance access to broadband. But I'm also just intrigued by people like Elon Musk, who, if you are not familiar with the Starlink project, I mean, this guy has got a brain as big as this room, but he comes up with all these crazy ideas which actually end up being very innovative. And the Starlink technologies are launching a bunch of small satellites into space, and through SpaceX's his reusable rockets, and giving people access to broadband basically anywhere on the planet. Now they're only at the beginning of this program now. Project now, but once they complete it, supposedly there'll be near universal access to broadband. At what price, I'm not sure, and that obviously is going to be a consideration. But I think there's ways that we can continue to enhance access to broadband now that it's no longer just a convenience. I think it's a necessity.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you. Well, this next question is a great one. I think everybody in this room believes that the oil and gas industry has a future in spite of what we may read in the paper or hear from Washington, D.C. And one of our earlier speakers talked about some exciting things that are going on in education related to oil and gas. And the question is this: what role do you think the education system can play to prepare the next generation of Americans for oil and gas industry, trades, and jobs?
Well, my favorite story along those lines is I was in Laredo, Texas about 3 or 4 years ago, and of course with the Eagle Ford Shale booming down there at the time, there were a lot of good paying jobs that they were just looking for a trained workforce for. And I remember going to a seventh grade science class, and basically they were teaching the basics of petroleum geology and everything from how to basically develop a competency to get a good, well-paying job in the oil and gas business. So to their credit, they viewed this at the junior college level or the community college and at the high school level as a way to train the workforce. Because I know that's going to continue to be a challenge as we all are more and more challenged by the technology enhancements and trends, and that certainly is true in the oil and gas business too. It's going to take more than a few roughnecks out on a rig, sling and chain, to get things done. And if our kids are going to have access to good, well-paying jobs, we've got to start early by providing them an opportunity to choose skills that will help make sure they are employable as well. They need that help, and our economy, and certainly the oil and gas sector needs that help.
Yes, sir. And the senator was talking earlier about, and he's well aware of the role of artificial intelligence and data sciences, just the amount of data we're moving in the industry now. And I know we have some incredibly bright people in the industry, young people that really are gifted in that area in terms of just handling the technology and the innovation. And it's been amazing to see the impact on the industry.
Well, I had a colleague who's since deceased, unfortunately, in the Senate when I got there. We were talking about the internet and that sort of thing, and some reporter asked him, well, what is the internet? And he said, well, it's a bunch of pipes. That's the way he described it. I mean, obviously, he didn't really have a good handle on that topic. But my point is that most legislators are generalists, and we hire good staff. We depend on our constituents to help educate us and inform us about things we need to do on their behalf. But you mentioned artificial intelligence. This is sort of the new buzzword. Data science, big data has been with us a while, but now we're producing so much data from so many sources. This is basically China's game right now. They've been stealing as much data as they can from every source that they can get. And now with artificial intelligence, they can exploit that data well beyond the capacity of human beings to review it and use it. And this is one of the big competitive challenges we have now with China, to make sure that we are competitive, and hopefully we'll beat them when it comes to the competition to not only get 5G implemented, but quantum computing, AI, and machine learning. And they're spending huge amounts of money to try to exploit that, not only for economic purposes, but also for military uses.
Right. Time for one more question, Kathy. Well, you just teed up the next question perfectly, sir. The question is really this, and I think it's appropriate. What are the geopolitical implications between the USA and China in an energy transition from oil and gas to solar and wind energy? And you talked about the competition, sir.
Well, one of the amendments that I was able to get accepted at that crazy markup in the Finance Committee, where they essentially tried to conduct a frontal attack on the oil and gas industry, was I said, you can't use any of these subsidies to buy Chinese manufactured electric vehicles. And even my colleagues who are big advocates of electric vehicles recognize that wouldn't go down very well. But we are, I like the way that I can't remember the name, Rand Corporation described China and Russia. They said, China is a rival, not a rogue. Russia is a rogue, not a rival. But what China has been doing over the years is slowly but surely building up their economy, and also, obviously they have a command and control economy. It's not like ours. And they have gradually been making huge investments in all these technology areas. They've been also stealing, as I said, as much data and intellectual property as they possibly can. They become increasingly belligerent in places like the South China Sea, through which it's not quite the Strait of Hormuz, but it's the Strait of Malacca, I think it's called, is a place through about 1/3 of the world's trade volume transports. And now they're building artificial islands, putting air bases on them, flooding that zone with fishing boats, which actually are working for the government in order to impede international transit through these international waters. So this is, to me, the number one challenge of our time. Russia was a big challenge because of nuclear weapons, and obviously we should all say a little prayer and be grateful for the fact that we've been able to deter the use of a nuclear weapon. And that's the reason why we've got to make sure that countries like Iran never get one, because they're not subject to the same rules or guidelines of deterrence. But China is going to continue to be a challenge for us, and we're going to have to change the way we think about what the role of the federal government is, I believe. I'm a free market conservative, but when I see China investing billions of dollars in the strategic investment in the things like 5G, AI, quantum computing, machine learning, and the like, I worry that we need to be competitive. And one of the things that COVID-19 did demonstrate is our vulnerability of our supply chains. 90% of the semiconductors made in the world come out of Asia. 63% of them come out of Taiwan. And so we've got to do some things a little differently. We've got to think differently if we're going to stay competitive with China, because obviously China is a police state. They are a massive surveillance state. I mean, it's one of the worst forms of government you can possibly imagine. But what they want to do is dominate us and reduce our sphere of influence in the world. And I think we've just got to double down and compete and win that competition.
Amen, sir. Absolutely. Well, Senator Cornyn, thank you again for your time today. We appreciate your leadership in Washington, D.C., and if you would please join me in thanking Senator John Cornyn for being here today.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you, Mr. Waits. It's an honor to have both of you here with us today. I'm Greg Jean. I'm with VME. We're an energy service and manufacturing company here in Tyler, a global organization, but headquartered right here in East Texas for the last 30 years. Our next speaker is Honorable Jason Isaac. Jason is the Director of Life Powered at Texas Public Policy Foundation. He's a state policy expert on affordable, reliable energy. Prior to joining the foundation, Jason was elected 4 times as a state representative in Texas Hill Country region. He's a graduate of Stephen F. Austin and is a board member of the Digital Education and the Work Initiative of Texas. Today, Jason's going to continue the theme of raising America's energy IQ. Please welcome Jason Isaac.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for having me again. I'm Jason Isaac. I'm the director of the Life Powered Project of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and I love getting an opportunity to speak to people that work in the oil and gas industry, because it gives me an opportunity to share my gratitude, because I want to thank you for what you're doing to end poverty around the world. I had an opportunity to share this with people in Midland, people that were working in the oil field industry, and thank them, and you could literally see their shoulders raise up and look at each other and like, wait, I thought we worked in the oil and gas industry. I didn't realize we worked in the industry of ending poverty around the world. But that's exactly what you do every day you go to work. Wayne Christian even hit on it. Global poverty in the last 10 years has been more than cut in half because of access to affordable, reliable energy. That's what the Life Powered Project does. We make the connection between access to affordable, reliable energy and human flourishing. So I want to share with you some messaging points that you can use to talk to people that may not be in the industry. They may be anti-fossil fuels, that may be anti-hydrocarbons. And one of those is expensive energy hurts the poor. So again, here's our mission statements, or some of our mission statements that we work towards. We think environmental policy should serve humanity and not the other way around. The domestic fossil fuels are increasingly clean, and exporting that to the rest of the world will improve lives and help the environment. Economic prosperity and environmental leadership go hand in hand. But let's look at expensive energy and how it hurts the poor and how it moves people in polling. You can see the red here are people that are already pro-energy. The green is kind of our target, our movable middle audience. and the blue are people that are anti. And these scores show how much, when you talk about how expensive energy hurts the poor, how much they will move and become pro-fossil fuels. You want to talk about an energy transition. This is what Greta Thunberg has been talking about, this question that just came up in the last discussion. The energy transition. I'll show you what the energy transition looks like. And I don't think that this next slide in this video, I don't think that UNICEF, when they shot this video, they thought that a proponent for fossil fuels and dense energy would ever be using one of their videos to make his case, but I'm doing exactly that. This is Aisha. This is what the energy transition looks like. The energy transition away from fossil fuels. Aisha's 13 years old. She's in Ethiopia. She's walking by herself. You'll notice the time stamps. I may jump ahead and give you the answers. 8 hours is how much time this 13-year-old girl walks by herself every day to collect water. Why is Aisha not in school? Women around the world bear the brunt of collecting water, wood, animal dung, and biomass to burn, to heat that water, to cook their food. It's over 200 million hours a day that women spend walking around the world to collect water. Imagine using that time to go to school, to start a career, to further your education, to get involved in civic engagement, running for office. But women like Aisha and others around the world aren't afforded that luxury because they don't have access to dense, reliable energy. And here she is, starting all over again. I showed this to a member of Congress's office, and one of his young staffers, a lady named Hannah, had told me that she spent time in Ethiopia doing missionary work. And she said, do you know what technology Aisha does have? And being naive, I think a cell phone. She says, no, Aisha has implantable birth control in her arm because she knows at some point in time she's going to be attacked on her journey. The World Bank refuses to lend funds to companies or to countries developing energy projects if those projects are based on fossil fuels. That was reversed during the previous administration. During the current administration, on day one, that policy was put back in place, forcing poverty amongst people like Aisha. It also is happening right here in the United States. Expensive energy hurting the poor. There's a group of over 200 civil rights organizations that would not necessarily align with a free market organization like the Texas Public Policy Foundation, are suing the California Air Resources Board, the state of California, saying that their environmental policies are violating the Civil Rights Act. Over 200 civil rights organizations, the 200. This is a great 80-page lawsuit ripe with talking points, and there's one right there. Did you know in California there are 44 cities that have banned natural gas utilities within their city limits? Banned them. Thanks to great legislative leaders like Senator Brian Hughes, we just passed House Bill 17, which makes that impossible in the state of Texas, effective now. Don't California my Texas, I think may have been the theme that you've heard from several speakers today, and that was a huge victory, big legislative victory for Texans and affordability. The next big mover that we have on getting people to be pro-dense energy is that the United States is a world leader in clean air. Look at this, people that are the target movable middle, this is one of the largest movers of getting those people to move. And you look at the numbers, I know Wayne shared this on one of his slides, the next slide will show we've reduced harmful pollution 77% in the last 50 years. We are a world leader at reducing harmful pollution. We're the only developed country over 50 million people that meets the World Health standards for safe and clean air. The only country in the world that meets that standard with a population over 50%. But people want to talk about CO2. People want to talk about CO2 because CO2 is necessary for life on Earth. 2/3 of the CO2 in our environment occurs naturally. The other third is from Topo Chico. So put those down because you're killing the planet. I joke a little bit. Some of it is created when you produce fossil fuels to produce electricity and keep people warm, keep millions of people alive in Texas during a freeze that we hadn't seen in 100 years. But the Topo Chico is serious. I joke with people about that, and I love using that as an analogy. So when your leftist friends come into your offices, just open one up and they think that you've just opened a explosive device. You didn't. Just a refreshing beverage. It's interesting to note that we heard this in leftist environmentalists in Austin preaching that we need to go 100% electric vehicles because our air quality has improved so much during the first 2 months of the COVID shutdowns because there are 50% fewer vehicles on the road. That means 50% of the people not going to work and providing income for their families, and this guy's wanting to mandate electric vehicles for everybody because the air quality got cleaner. Well, it's fortunate because I've got a brilliant scientist who'll come up and speak next. I asked him to look at our air quality measuring devices around the state and see what the air quality had done. And he's giving this speech to the University of Texas saying the air quality had improved significantly during the first 2 months in the city of Austin. The facts tell a different story. The air quality actually got worse during the first 2 months of the COVID shutdown in Austin and other cities around the country with 40 to 50% fewer vehicles. If we're concerned about climate crisis, let's hang up the mission accomplished banner. We have won. We've achieved it. Our air quality is near a natural state in the United States. And when you take 50% of the vehicles off the road and the air quality gets worse, we've done incredible jobs with improving our air quality. But again, people want to go back and talk about CO2, necessary for life on Earth. It's about control. Don't repeat the negative. And that's what the left does. They want to control everything we do in our lives, and you do that with talking about CO2. Let's talk about the harmful pollution that actually impacts human health, and we are world leaders in that particular area. Oh gosh, this is one thing that I love to talk a little bit about is how we export our jobs and we import pollution. There's a 65% increase in ozone in Southern California that's attributable to Asian air pollution. And I think that the senator talked about how the Chinese steal our IP, our intellectual property. They steal our technology. I've talked to members of Congress before. I said, of all the things the Chinese steal from us, it'd be nice if they'd utilize our pollution control technology. But they don't, and that actually impacts the air quality here in the United States. That pollution blows as far east as Houston from China, of all places. We should not have a Paris Climate Accord. We should have a Pittsburgh Climate Accord that says meet our air quality standards if you want to do business with the United States. That will improve the global environment. That will improve human health. But no, the Chinese just want to keep burning and they could care less about the environment. Let's talk a little bit about the dark side of energy subsidies. We've done a lot of research on this and why are we moving so far with propping up unreliable sources of electric generation. Well, when you put billions of dollars into propping those up, the market is going to respond. In this next slide, we'll show you some of the data that Wayne used on his presentation. Look at how much the subsidies are given to these sources of electric generation per megawatt hour of electricity produced. How do you compete when wind is getting $18.86 per megawatt hour of electricity produced when the average cost sold in the ERCOT market is about $23? You can't. And that's why you'll see the next slide, what we've experienced over the last 12 years or 10 years or so. We've seen a net decrease in thermal reliable generation close to about 5% since 2012. Wind and solar have increased during this time frame 193%. Look at the amount of electricity they were producing during the blackouts. Wind and solar, 33% of our installed capacity, were producing just over 8% of the electricity. Thermal generation, 66% of our installed capacity was producing 91% of our electricity. But these market distorting policies that we've put in place have got us to this point, and that's why we have advocated for about a decade at the Texas Public Policy Foundation to get rid of them, the federal ones, the production tax credit, the investment tax credit, the property tax exemptions here in the state of Texas through Chapter 312 and 313, And once again, I mentioned Senator Brian Hughes because he was a legislative champion, because Ronald Reagan says there's nothing as permanent as a temporary government program. Nothing is permanent as a temporary government program except in Texas. Because Brian Hughes was a no vote on this particular bill in committee. It never got brought up to the House or the Senate floor for consideration. And at the end of 2022, that property tax exemption that 2/3 of the project go to unreliable electric generation is sunsetting and going away, which will relieve our property tax burdens around the state. Senator, thank you for your leadership on that. Let's talk a little bit about energy density, because this next slide I like to show a little bit, and if you can really see that really tiny blue small dot there on the bottom left, that's the equivalent amount of land, 3 square miles, to produce 1,000 megawatts of electricity. A natural gas plant is not 3 square miles big. That includes the exploration, production, pipelines, everything necessary to produce 1,000 megawatts of electricity. Look at the comparison for solar, 27 square miles when the sun is shining. The environmental alarmists will say the greatest threat to endangered species is loss of habitat. You really want to lose habitat? Let's go 100% renewable. You really want to get rid of endangered species? You wind up getting rid of all of the species, and maybe that's what the left wants to do. They do think that humans are the problems, and this is one way to get rid of us, is have unreliable electricity, as over 200 people found out in February. Look at the amount of land space there for wind. It's 115 square miles. Keep in mind that's when the wind is blowing. Man, I love dense energy. Love dense energy. You really want to protect the environment? You want to be conservationists at heart? We should be using good dense energy like natural gas, coal, and nuclear for our electric production. There's been this climate cartel of banks and financial institutions that have been colluding to harm American oil and gas producers to prop up their own bad investments in what I call green bling and renewable dreams. It's companies like BlackRock and Larry Fink who writes his letter to CEOs saying that you need to get out of the production of fossil fuels and you need to transition to 100% renewable. You need to be net zero. And as I like to say, net zero means 0 jobs. Net zero means 0 electricity. And net zero doesn't do anything to improve the environment. We've done the research extensively. At the request of Senator Cornyn a couple of years ago, what would it cost for the Green New Deal to be implemented in the state of Texas? Thousands of dollars for every family. Going carbon-free electricity in the United States. Reducing all fossil fuel use by 2030 has a temperature mitigation difference of less than 0.2 of a degree by 2100. Less than 0.2 of a degree, but completely decimates our economy. And again, they're focusing on carbon dioxide because they want to control every aspect of our lives. Carbon dioxide, which is 0.04% of our atmosphere. Maybe that's why when AOC wrote the Green New Deal, she called for the elimination of all greenhouse gases. Not a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, the elimination of all greenhouse gases, the largest of which is water vapor. So if you want to eliminate all greenhouse gases, you definitely eliminate all life on Earth, which is maybe why she wrote it. I don't know. I've read it repeatedly, and I was like, why would you want to kill everyone on the planet? But that's her prerogative. I don't know. But it's kind of a career-limiting move when you correct a sitting railroad commissioner, fellow lumberjack with me. But I'm going to do that because he talked about ESG and he got the acronyms wrong. It's actually expensive, scarce, and government-controlled is what ESG stands for, Wayne. But we've seen this movement to discriminate against responsible production of oil and gas. Banks like BlackRock. We saw it first with the Bank of the West a few years ago. The Bank of the West was founded in the western United States in coal-producing counties, the coal-producing part of the country, and then now it became this big oil and gas production part of the country, and they said, we're no longer going to make funds available to companies that are involved in the production of oil and gas or coal, completely discriminating against a big customer base of theirs. And then we saw movements by Chase Bank. Had great testimony for a particular piece of legislation that worked its way through the legislature this year when this guy was actually at the state affairs hearing to testify on a gun bill. And he says, wait a second, this sounds like something I'm interested in. What are they working on? And we were working on this effort modeled after legislation in 2017, my last legislative session, which when the legislature said, if you're going to boycott, divest, or sanction Israel, then you're no longer welcome to do business with the state of Texas. And so about a year and a half ago, I started writing a piece of legislation because I kept hearing these stories over and over, like the guy shared at State Affairs, who jumped up and testified in support of this bill and said, you know, I had Chase Bank line of credit for 20 years, successful oil and gas business with just over 50 employees. And all of a sudden, Chase cut my $500,000 line of credit. And my employees and I started to worry. How are we going to be able to provide for our families? How are we going to be able to do business? And so he went to other banks. And interestingly enough, he said the bank that he found proved that this wasn't about dollars and cents with Chase. It was about virtue signaling, because he got a loan or a line of credit from Frost Bank, not for $500,000, but for $1 million. So nice to see a good Texas bank like Frost Bank supporting our oil and gas industry. Something that, as you look to where you place your dollars in deposit, you might want to go out there and find out if they're working against your industry, because you might want to move your money, because the state of Texas is going to be moving its money. Because we passed Senate Bill 13. An incredible bill that, like I said, I started writing about a year and a half ago and working on with legislators. And we're the first state in the nation to pass legislation that says if you're going to boycott the responsible production of fossil fuels, then the state of Texas is no longer open business for you. So when your state employees, yes, big win. This is a big win for the state of Texas. I remember one of my former employees that worked with me in the Capitol, she shows me her 401k statement one day. 100% of her funds are invested with BlackRock. 100%. So we're giving BlackRock, our state employees, money to invest. BlackRock is buying shares in companies like 6% of ExxonMobil, like 5% minimum of 92% of the companies in the S&P 500. And then they get the right to vote those shares. And that's why ExxonMobil has 2 radical environmentalists that just won board seats, and it's likely a third, because I guess they're still counting the ballots, or that ballot box 13 is still coming in, and they're going to figure it out. But it's likely they're going to get 3 radicals that are going to try to do the energy transformation to ExxonMobil, which is just heartbreaking to me, to see a company that's worked so hard to reduce poverty around the world, and people want them to do the energy transition. But that's what BlackRock does. And so we're going to kick BlackRock out of our 401k. We're going to kick companies like Chase and Bank of the West out of holding deposits. The municipal debt is the biggest area where we're going to hurt these financial institutions that are discriminating against energy in the state of Texas. There's about $400 billion in municipal debt. That's roads, that's buildings, libraries, schools, stadiums, $400 billion in debt in the state of Texas. And just a day, I think it maybe 2 or 3 days after this bill was officially finally passed, that's when I turned my computer off from watching the legislative session. It was about Friday night at about 7:30 when Senator Brian Birdwell brought it up for consideration. It passed. I'm like, I'm done. I'm checked out. I'm out of here. Have a great session. There was still a few days left and a lot of work left to be done. But I think it was the following Tuesday, which was maybe 2 days ago, the treasurer of the state of Pennsylvania, following Texas' lead, sends this warning to banks that are boycotting fossil fuels that she's going to move $4 billion of state assets out of those financial institutions. And this is where you hit them. This is where you get them to come to the table and talk about the catastrophic climate crisis. This catastrophic climate crisis, keep in mind there's been a 99% reduction in deaths from climate-related events over the last 100 years. Boom, mission accomplished. Where's the banner? Where's the fireworks? We're done, we've won. But they don't want to do that. They want to prop up their bad investments, again, in the green bling and renewable dreams, because that's exactly what they are. They're bad investments that can't live without heavily being subsidized from the state and federal government. So we've won big, and you'll see some of these names in these articles that come across the screen here in just a second. One of the names is Brian Deese. He's the former global head of sustainable investing at BlackRock. The former head of the global head of sustainable investing at BlackRock. He's now the director of the National Economic Council working for President Biden. It's heartbreaking. People want to take our tax dollars away from us and increase our costs. But that was Senate Bill 13, another huge win for us. And the last thing I want to talk about, I'm going to finish a few minutes early. The last thing I want to talk about is we've talked about this demonization of fossil fuels. We've heard about it. We continue to hear about it. I shared with you some messaging points. There's a lot more at lifepower.org that you can learn about and watch videos, share short videos with your kids. And I know that those videos took off during the first couple of weeks of the shutdown because parents were looking for instructional materials to show their kids. We've got good information, unbiased information about energy produced in the state of Texas. We're working on transforming kids at the youngest level to get them education that's unbiased about all forms of energy produced in the state of Texas. My high school senior that just graduated last week, that's heading not to Stephen F. Austin, unfortunately, is going to Texas Tech to study energy commerce. So he is going there because he's passionate about energy. But when he came home, 5th grade STAR test, and says, Dad, I got my science STAR test coming up. I need you to ask me these questions. And I get to about question 20, and I was in the legislature at the time, and I get to this one question, and it's the only question on energy on a 100-question test prep packet about science. Which of the following fossil fuels causes global warming? Oh, my head exploded. And I'm like, oil, gas, coal, D, all of the above. Brian's made some of these calls. Wayne's made some of these calls. I called the TEA the next day and Texas Education Agency. And I said, is this question on the STAR test? And they called me about 2 days later, and they confirmed that it was. And I said, it needs to be removed. And they called me back a week later, and they pulled the question from the test and is no longer on our STAR test. And that set me out on a mission to raise funds and to update our energy curriculum in the schools of Texas, because the Sierra Club and other radical environmentalists that are peddling this chronic fear of environmental doom, which is a named diagnosis that over 50% of the kids suffer from today, chronic fear of environmental doom. The organizations that are peddling that are at the lowest levels of our government. They're at the SBOE, but 10 years ago, I didn't know what the SBOE stood for. It's our State Board of Education. They're at the Texas Education Agency. They've infiltrated our Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. We need to be raising kids and educating them about all forms of energy produced in Texas, not with a negative spin, but with a positive spin that's pro-American, that's pro-Texan, because we are world leaders in environmental protection, we're world leaders in environmental quality, and we're world leaders at reducing poverty. It's incredible. I saw a tanker arrive from Texas yesterday in Buenos Aires full of Texas liquefied natural gas, helping Argentinians. We're exporting our economic prosperity, and we're exporting our clean air around the world. So we partnered with the Midland Independent School District, and the way you change education curriculum is you have to get the standards updated. And 2 years ago, we have new high school standards approved by the Midland Independent School District because private organizations, nonprofits like ours, can't submit curriculum standards. School districts do that. And so now kids have this new curriculum set of standards that are unbiased information, actual positive things about energy produced in the state of Texas. So we'll be directing more kids to go to Wayne Christian's, the school that he talked about, because they're going to get interested in it at an early age and not demonized, not scared of fossil fuels. They want to work like I do every single day to try to end poverty on this globe. The poor will always be with us, but we have an opportunity. We are standing on top of the key to end poverty around this world, and you are going to work every single day to turn that lock and pull that key out of the ground so that we can help people. And so I'm excited. If you're interested in getting involved or would like to learn more about our education efforts, it is a huge passion of mine that we raise this money, that we hire somebody that can work with our State Board of Education, with our Texas Education Agency, so that we can continue to develop additional curriculum units. We want to fill up the high school curriculum and then start working our way down to kindergarten. So these kids at the youngest ages in our public schools are learning great things about the work that you're doing every single day, so that you don't have to talk to them about energy poverty. They know about it coming out of grade school. And that's the work we like to do at the Life Powered. I'd appreciate any opportunities we can have to discuss that. I'd appreciate your support. Thank you so much for your time and your work. I appreciate what you do. God bless you.
Hi, I'm Roy Maynard. Most of y'all know me. In 2008, my dear friend Everett Taylor retired as the editorial page editor of the Tyler Morning Telegraph, and I stepped into that position. I quickly realized that I had very little material, op-eds and commentary that talked about Texas things, that hit on Texas issues. I had lots of national stuff. I had Walter Williams, Charles Krauthammer. I didn't have anything Texas specific. I thought, well, there's got to be somebody out there. There's got to be something like a heritage foundation for Texas. So I started looking around, and I found the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And everything I read just told me this group is solid. Their research was unimpeachable. Their commentary was level-headed. Their experts truly were experts in their fields. So I called and said, hey, I've got an editorial page I got to fill up every day. Can you guys help me out? And they said, we love you. I had no idea that one day I would be working with them, that I would become a part of the Texas Public Policy Foundation and work for these brilliant people and help get their ideas spread throughout the nation. One of the brilliant people I get to work with is Dr. Brent Bennett. Brent is the policy director for Life Powered. As part of Life Powered, Brent is responsible for research, fact-checking, and spearheading many of the team's policy and regulatory initiatives. He has a PhD in materials science and engineering from the University of Texas at Austin and a bachelor in physics from the University of Tulsa. His graduate research focused on advanced chemistries for utility-scale energy storage systems. He's a native of Midland and a passionate student of energy and a proponent of freedom and human flourishing. So Brent, come on.
Well, thank you, Roy, and thanks to the committee for giving Jason and myself a full hour to talk about some of the things that we do in Life Powered, and it's really an honor to be in front of such a great group of people. As Roy said, I'm originally from Midland, but I've, over the course of my life growing up in the oil and gas business, met a lot of great East Texas folks, and this is my first time to get to actually come and do business, do work in Tyler, so it's really a great honor to be here. So go ahead and go to the first couple slides there, yeah. So a little bit about myself. Yes, I used to be a battery scientist and engineer. Although, as Jason can tell you, I can never keep my phone charged. So even though I can build batteries, I can never keep my own phone charged. Hopefully, I'm reading my slides off of mine up here. Hopefully, I've got enough battery in it. That was one of the things that inspired me to go into the field was, the fact that we do need better batteries. And that's still the case now, as it was 15 years ago when I decided to start doing that. But anyways, I grew up in Midland, and it was interesting. I think Wayne mentioned it a while back. It was interesting growing up in that time in the 90s, mainly when I was a kid, and to see how peak oil was such a thing. We thought just in the 70s, we thought in the 90s and 2000s, there was still a thing that we were going to run out of oil, and how much that's changed now. I didn't go into the oil and gas business because I didn't think that it would be something that would last for my whole career. And I was interested in other things, other aspects of energy, batteries, nuclear, and so on, so I kind of went into that field. But to see now here I am back doing energy policy and still, in a way, working in the oil and gas business. It's something that, and it's bigger than it ever was before. So I think it's something for us to keep in mind that it's really hard to predict the future, and that we should all be proud of doing what we're doing and living in the present and doing what we can to better the world right now. So what I'll kind of go through in my talk, I want to kind of touch on two things. One is to look back at the storm in February and to give some perspective on what we found in our research on what happened, some things you probably didn't hear in the media narrative, and then also to look forward at what is Texas going to do about it, what does the future hold for particularly the electric grid over the next 10 years or so in Texas, and how are we going to manage the changes, both the policy and just the market changes that are coming our way in Texas. So hopefully that'll be informative for y'all, and think of some questions if you want to ask me. I might have a few minutes here at the end since Jason gave me some extra time. But I want to first talk about the storm. If you can go to the next slide there, yeah. So the media narrative, of course, focused on the weather, right? This was an unprecedented weather event. Well, it was sort of unprecedented. We had some couple big freezes in the 80s too, which weren't quite this long. But that was kind of the focus, was the weather, right? And that was, and so yeah, there were a lot of weather problems, right? About 60% of the outages, the thermal plants during the storm were weather related in some way, either due to power plant failures or gas supply shortages or some other type of problems. About 40% was due to more other types of regular outages, long-term maintenance, which we typically do starting in February to get plants ready for the summertime, because everyone's preparing for the summer in Texas. We know we're going to have hot summers, right? So that's what all the power plants are preparing for. And then there's always going to be some level of outages just from random equipment failures and things like that. You never have 100% of the power plants running all the time, right? So I think so there was, this huge focus on that 60%, right, which is a big number. But keep in mind that, we always need some level of resilience and backup in the system. We can't run it at just a 0% reserve margin and expect to, have reliable energy. So there always has to be some of that margin in there. And the problem is that, what wasn't focused on a lot of in the media narrative, is that there are systemic market issues that are leading to the erosion of our reliable backup power, that reliable power supply, right? And that's really what I think we need to get into a little more of as going forward, is to look at those market issues and see what do we need to change within our market to make sure that we have enough reliable energy, right? So one thing to keep in mind, if you go to the next slide there, is that even if we didn't have that 60% of outages that we had from due to the weather, even if we were to solve that 60%, right, and weatherize everything, we still would have been short for over 24 hours during the storm, right? Because of that other 40%, and because of the fact that we don't really have enough generation capacity to meet that level of demand. Now, it was unprecedented for us to have this level of demand during the wintertime, right? And that's that dotted line up there, right? To have over 75 gigawatts of demand is what we would have had if we hadn't had the blackouts. It's unprecedented in the wintertime, but in the summertime, that's going to be very common, right? We're probably going to see more that level of demand this summer and going forward, right? So we have to think about what are the market problems that we need to address moving forward, once we figure out some of the problems that were specific to the storm, right? So I think that's something that was kind of lost, is that because of all the weather problems, it kind of covered up a lot of the market problems that we still need to address, right? And those are what the legislature, passed some legislation I'll talk about in a sec that gets the ball started on that, but it's going to be a lot of work still going forward for the next few years. If you go to the next slide there, of course, there's a lot of talk about the wind and the problems with wind turbines and so on, which was quite true, I think, during the first part of the storm on Sunday night into Monday morning, right, when there was a fair amount of wind blowing, right, and the fact that we had a lot of freezing did create a pretty big shortage there. The difference between the gray and the blue shaded areas is basically the difference the difference in output based on how many wind turbines were down, right? So if we'd had them all operating, we would have been at the top of the gray line, and instead we were at the blue line, right? But you can see as we go through the storm, there was a lot of periods during the storm where we just didn't have any wind, right? And so this is not a problem of like a mechanical problem, right? Where, okay, we need to go out and fix these wind turbines and winterize and so on. This is a resource problem. This is a planning problem, right? It's not that it's not a technological problem. It's something that we need to be able to plan for this, right? For, not having those resources when we need them the most, right? It's not the fault of the resources, it just is what it is, right? And we have to plan, it's a fault of us for not planning for that, right? So we got to think about that going forward, because again, the winter storm was not just a weather problem, it was a market problem of not planning for these types of outages. So another way to look at it, and go to the next slide, is basically, that's kind of a different way of looking at the previous slide, where you just take out that gray chunk, right? So yeah, there's a lot of weather-related outages early in the storm, but as you go along, right? There just wasn't the resources there. Even if we had all the wind turbines operating, there wasn't enough wind to turn them, right, during the height of the storm. And this is also true during the summertime, right? During the peak summer hours, there's not much wind blowing, right? Now the solar that we're building, it comes around pretty good in the summertime, but it's still also very variable, so we have to plan for that, right? And so what are we gonna do? And so what are we gonna do about that? Let's go ahead to the next slide. This is just another way of kind of representing the problem, the planning problem, so to speak, right? So the orange shaded areas there are the wind output before and after the storm. So you see that before it got cold, about a few days before the storm, there was a lot of wind, prices were very low, right? And then during the storm, the wind, died down as it always does when it gets really cold or really hot. And then it finally, once it got warm again, the weekend after the storm, the wind started blowing again, and prices actually went negative after just a few days after they were at their maximum. So it's how do we design a market for this? It's crazy. It's a really difficult problem, right? That level of variability, and how do we design for that is going to be a huge problem going forward. Now let's look ahead at the summertime now. So first of all, we kind of knock on the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, ERCOT. We kind of knock on them a lot. They have a hard job, and unfortunately, they're still kind of stuck in this kind of idea that that the variability of wind and solar is manageable, that we don't need something new to fix it, right? And they keep forecasting that, okay, if the wind and solar produce at their average amount, right, we're gonna have a certain level of reserve margin. Well, we need to be planning for the variability, not just for their average output, right? So when we see ERCOT saying, well, we're gonna have plenty of resources for the summertime, they're talking about the average output of wind and solar. And when you have a resource that varies 40% across its average, instead of gas, nuke, and coal that vary only a few percent about their average, it's a big difference. And we're still not, I think, properly accounting for that in our planning margins. So this is something that, when you see these reports, you gotta think about, okay, well, are they really doing the math right? And we need to fix some of that going forward. So we need to have better math and better planning. So the question is how long will Texas keep dodging the bullet, right? February, the bullet hit us. But we've known that also, and that was a surprise, again, because of the level of demand that we saw in February was unprecedented. But we know this is gonna happen during the summer. And during each of the last 3 summers, we've been really close to having outages. The last summer we probably would have if it wasn't for the fact that COVID reduced demand just enough to keep us in good shape. This summer we'll see, it depends on the weather. If it gets hot enough, then we can definitely see some outages. I mean, right now we're in pretty good shape because we've had so much rain and it's cool, but we'll see come August. Again, we're counting on things going right. We're not planning for when things go wrong. And so that's something that we really got to address going forward. So where are we going, I guess, now, having seen, okay, February happened, it exposed some serious market problems. Where are we going forward, right? And the problem is that we're actually, we're going pretty breakneck toward a really heavy renewable grid. We're right there with California in terms of leading the nation and moving towards reliance on wind and solar. And so we can do that, but we have to plan for it, and we have to pay for reliability. So we can make a choice to do that, but we're going to have to pay for it, and how much we want to pay for it, and what's the right balance of that. That's a really hard question. We did a little study. We actually, this is actually for some research that we did in part to help with something that Senator Cornyn's team wanted us to work on, which is to say, what would it take for Texas to go 100% wind and solar? And back in 2019, we kind of did some forecasts and said, well, our current policies, if we don't do anything, might get us to that second column on the left there by about 2030. Actually, we're going to be there next year. We're going to hit about that level of wind and solar capacity next year. And so we're actually moving a lot faster than we predicted a couple years ago. And we could easily see 50% by 2030 if we don't change anything. Much less if the federal government continues to push the boundaries of, with a clean electricity standard, with more subsidies and so on. We could be even further than that. So how are we going to deal with that? That we really have to think about that. And how are we going to keep the costs from escalating like they do in that those bottom two rows right there? How are we going to keep costs down, right? What's the right balance for that? Because I don't think we all want to be paying, 4 or 5 times for our electricity. I don't think anyone's going to accept that. Certainly not those who are already struggling to afford their energy bills. So this is a conversation that we need to be having both in the legislature and the PUC. And thankfully, the legislature is starting to respond, and February did provide an impetus to respond. I mean, Senator Hughes and a lot of other people worked really, really hard to try and get some things done in the course of 3 months amid everything else that was going on. And I think they did, and Senate Bill 3, I think, as we say, it kind of opened the door to some reforms. And we're going to have to now spend the next few years walking through that door and making sure that those reforms are implemented. Of course, some key reforms were, again, addressing the problems specific to the storm, weatherizing power plants, infrastructure, and so on. But I think the really 2 key sections of that bill are really Section 14 and Section 18 that talk about modifying our reliability programs in Texas. So setting more stringent reliability standards and also modifying the market mechanisms and the services that we are trying to provide to ensure more reliability. And so now it's going to be up to the Public Utility Commission and maybe some more future legislation to make sure that we follow through on that. Because if we don't, then what we saw in February is going to happen more and more often because we're paying for our energy from wind and solar, but we're not paying for the reliability that we need. We're not paying to make sure that energy is there when we need it. So I think that's really key. There's also, of course, we heard a lot about how expensive the storm was and the costs that were incurred during that. So the legislatures worked really hard to try and provide some mechanisms for securitizing that debt, making sure that it can be paid off over a long period of time at a low interest rate. That's going to raise our bills too, right? It has to. And so we have to and so that's going to be another factor as well. And going forward, we just seen how expensive unreliability is, and we're going to see our bills go up because of what happened in February. So again, we have to think about that as we're trying to, make reforms, trying to build in more resiliency into our grid. It's going to be a really tough balance. Another key point is transmission. In Texas, customers pay for transmission. Our transmission costs have more than doubled, or actually roughly just about doubled in the past 10 years because of paying for all the transmission to go out to West Texas and South Texas to build more wind and solar. And these resources cost more in terms of transmission because they're so spread out, right? It takes a lot of transmission to get that into our city centers. And so we think a really key point going forward is making sure that we have a balance in terms of how transmission is paid for. Right now, we as consumers pay for it. If the generators, and we need to make generators pay more for transmission in Texas because that will force them to be more economic in terms of their siting decisions and what they do, and making sure that the cost to consumers are as low as possible. So that's a really key reform that we think will be needed going forward. And again, we've opened the door to that, but we now need to follow through on it and really work hard on that. And the Life Power team, Texas Public Policy Foundation, is going to hopefully be a leader in that effort over the next few years. So I want to get now into some of my favorite subjects is looking forward is why do we need firm generation? Why do we need backup power? Why do we need resiliency? Why can't we just build batteries to solve the problems of wind and solar intermittency, right? That's what I got into 12 years ago when I started grad school, trying to answer that question. And it's still a tough question to answer. The fact is that it's not a question so much of technology, but one of scale, right? And even if you read into a lot of the academic studies that do energy modeling, that even the authors of the Princeton study that's being used by the Biden administration to look at how we can go 100% wind and solar, those same guys will tell you that batteries and demand flexibility are not a substitute for firm generation from gas, coal, and nuclear, right? There's limitations of scale. You can use batteries and demand response to manage day-to-day small fluctuations, but to manage seasonal fluctuations, especially what happened in February, It takes a huge level of scale, thousands of times greater than anything we have now, to get to that level of scale if we're going to have 100% wind and solar, right? So it's just an enormous problem. And one thing I like to think about it is that if you want to have a day worth of energy stored in Texas, so you take all the electricity we consume in one day in Texas, and if you wanted to store that in a battery, you'd have to take the largest battery that we're building right now, which is 100 megawatts, and do that every day for the next 13 years through 2035 if we're going to get enough energy just to store 1 day worth of electricity in Texas, right? So we have plenty of technologies that can work on the grid in terms of energy storage. I've built some. I've seen dozens. But how are we going to get to that scale? And so I want to talk a little bit about that and just give you all some food for thought as you go home and start to, read. And you always read these articles about all these great battery technologies. So I want to take about 5 minutes to kind of leave you with some thoughts on some of that going forward and why it's going to be such a challenge to get beyond kind of marginal production of wind and solar, right? That's what we're moving towards now. In Texas, we're at about 25%, and we're moving towards 50 pretty quickly. So what is it going to take? So one thing about producing electricity is that energy does that. It's not just about generating electricity. You have to transport and store it, right? So when people talk about how cheap wind and solar is, they're talking about how cheap it is to generate that electricity, right? If we're going to have that electricity when we need it, we also have to transport it and we have to store it, right? And I just talked about how expensive transporting it is. Our transmission costs have doubled in the last 10 years in Texas to get all that wind and solar from distant places into the cities, right? Storage is also a crucial element. To build a battery that can store the same amount of energy that you get from 1,000 tons of coal or 300 tons of natural gas is about, I can't remember, it's about $600 million compared to about $30,000. So it's about, 200 something times, right? So that's a huge difference. Now, that's a little bit disingenuous because you actually, you cycle a battery quite a bit, right? You don't use it once the way you do fuel, right? But even if you cut that by a factor of 2,000, right? So I think the next slide, if you click it, yeah. So if you do it on a per cycle basis, right? You cut that battery cost by a factor of 2,000 to say, okay, per cycle, for every cycle of that battery's life, how much is it costing? It's still 10 times more expensive. So when you hear about batteries being introduced in the grid, you got to think you think about, okay, if we're going to even come close to, just for 5 hours of energy storage, just to come close to the fuel cost of gas and coal, we need to cut those battery costs by a factor of 10. That's just to get 5 hours worth, right? We're not talking days worth like what we needed in February. So again, this is a huge scaling problem that we have to face going forward. So what are some of the technologies that we're looking at now? Mechanical and thermal storage there's a lot of possibilities there. They're cheap. I've seen everything from, of course, the old pumped hydro, right, pumping water up a hill. There's all kinds of what they call gravity storage. Basically, I've seen there's a company that's stacking concrete blocks on top of each other. They have this device that stacks concrete blocks in order to store energy using the gravity, basically, to store the energy. These are all interesting technologies, and they're cheap, but they're also difficult to deploy, right? They're very low energy density, so they take up a lot of space. And they also require a lot of materials, right? There's the type of batteries I used to work on, which are basically very low energy density liquid batteries, and they use a lot of cheap materials. But again, they're also low energy. They require a lot of materials, a lot of supply chain issues with that, right? So we have those, but again, they're very difficult to deploy at scale. And then finally, you have your lithium-ion batteries and your high-energy density batteries, which are primarily what's going out now, right? And those are good. They're high energy density, but they're also more expensive. And bringing that cost down, like I showed in the last slide, 10x is going to be very difficult. So there's all these things that are out there, and it's great that we're working on them. And I think there's a lot of smart people out there, a lot of people that are smarter than me that are working on that stuff. But it's going to be very difficult to deploy at scale. And so we have to think about that going forward in terms of our policy. It's not just going to be a technology thing. We have to think about the scale that's required. Now, I always have a great idea about what we can do with batteries. One thing I like to think of is potatoes. So has anyone ever made a potato battery? Yeah, I see some hands back there, yeah. Right? What about potatoes? They're great. They're renewable. They're cheap and abundant, right? Why not use potatoes? Well, actually, potatoes just provide the liquid medium. You actually have to stick 2 nails in them, which is where the chemical reaction happens to create the energy, right? But really, how much, I think people's concept of energy storage and just energy in general doesn't get far beyond this, right? This is the things that we play around with, and we think, well, okay, yeah, we can, we're going to come up with something that is great. It'll just take time and give it time, and then we'll come up with something. Well, I mean, it's not. You can't just dream up something like a potato battery and dream that into existence. You have to go out and think about what is the physics, what are the limitations of what we're doing, right? When we're setting policy, and unfortunately, our policy has become very disconnected from what are the real physical limitations of our energy system. So, couple more slides to end with here. As I said before, technology is not the problem, scale is, right? So if you look at where we are now, this is a forecast from Bloomberg. If you look at where we are now, we have just about 8 gigawatts of energy storage around the world right now on the grid. And you look at where Bloomberg says we're going to go, we're going to get a lot more than that. Even just the United States alone, we're going to get they're saying we'll have about 200 gigawatts within the next 15 to 20 years, right? So that's a pretty big number, right? Well, how much energy can that actually store? If you can go to the next click there. That's only about 2 hours of U.S. energy demand. So even an optimistic forecast of growth, what is that? Almost 100x growth in our amount of energy storage that we have now compared to over the next 20 years, will only get us to 2 hours of U.S. demand. Right? We need at least a day, probably several days worth of energy storage to get anywhere close to 100% renewable. And that's a physical reality that we have to come to grips with as we're talking about, going, net zero by 2050 or going 100% renewable by 2035 or 2040, right? Right now, even an optimistic forecast has us coming up, at least 10 to 20 times short of that. And so that's assuming a huge 50x growth, right? So it's pretty crazy when you start running the numbers on how disconnected some of these policies are from the physical realities of the energy system. And so that's kind of my goal in what I do. What inspires me to work with such a great team at TPPF is that I want to help people understand in the policy world, kind of reconnect the policy world to those physical realities when it comes to energy, because it's so important. And I also think it's really important for us to consider, if you go to the next slide, what is it that makes an energy source good? Jason kind of touched on this. What makes an energy source good, right? We always think of good and bad energy. I don't think there is such a thing. There's certain aspects of different energy sources that are better than others, right? There's no good or bad energy, right? They all have different things that they're good at, right? And if you think about it, really our public discussion has come down to impact there down in the bottom. Do we really talk about those top 3 things, abundance, affordability, reliability? Not really, because we just kind of assume that it's going to be there. And in terms of impact, too, really the discussion is so much about air emissions, carbon dioxide and other air emissions. But what about land impacts? What about materials impacts? All the different things that go into making energy. It's not really discussed much. And I think we need to broaden it if we're going to change the way the discussion happens in the United States and around the world. We need to broaden that discussion about impacts and about the other aspects of energy that are so important. And what are the physical aspects of energy? The ability to transport it, to store it. All these things need to be talked about. We need to think of ways to convey this to people, and not just to think of wind and solar is good, fossil fuels are bad, or nuclear is good, whatever, right? So it's really got to think about things holistically. So that's really what I'm on a mission to do. And I think the way to do that, the way to improve our energy system is through markets. We all operate in energy markets, and we've seen what the value of energy markets are. And it's so hard. I think it's really hard on a policy level to really put all these things in their, put all those factors in their place, right? What's the right balance of affordability, low impact, and so on. I think as policymakers, we need to think more about how do we empower markets to make those decisions, to find that right balance. Going forward in Texas, with our electric grid, how do we create a market such that the market can find that correct balance? I think that's really the key question, because and that's how we're going to win, how we're going to improve our lives, how we're going to beat the Chinese and remain the world power is through markets. It's not by copying the Chinese and doing what they're doing. I think we're going to beat them by having better markets, better people, and better innovation. That's really what it's going to take. And so that's the message I want to leave y'all, is to always be cognizant of the power of markets, be cognizant of how much markets have done for us, what they've done for us and our children, and to always maintain that going forward, that markets and freedom will promote human flourishing, not government. So with that, I thank you for listening to me, and really appreciate the time that I've been afforded here. Thank you.
I'd like to thank everyone for your presence here. This has been such a great event, chock full of knowledge. And I thank every one of the presenters, and I'd like to thank Senator Cornyn and his staff for having made his presence here possible. Brian, thank you, sir, for the legislation you've helped push through. And we from the natural gas industry really appreciate all your efforts, sir, and successes. We appreciate that very, very much. I'd like to mention that the broadcast of this can be found in a few days on our Tyler Area Chamber of Commerce website. You can click on a link and then watch the rebroadcast of the presentations. I'd also like to thank once again the Energy Subcommittee members for making this event such a success, and our sponsors. Again, we could not be able to put on this presentation without the help of our sponsors, or with the presence of you, my friends, and fellow members of our community. With that, let me remind you that the next event coming up right here at Green Acres is none other than the State of the City with Mayor Don Warren. On June 22nd, I hear some hurrahs over there, so people are getting excited about that. With that final announcement, I am Claude Figueroa. It's been my pleasure to be your host for today's event, and I hope to see you all again next year. We are dismissed.